Alright, good evening and welcome to Week 4, Part 2 of Cold War America, where we'll be addressing the issue of East European Reconstruction, the Cold War, in particular identifying the process of how East European nations came under Soviet domination and what the pros and cons were of actually being part of the larger Soviet system when it came to communism. As has already been identified in your readings, the real trigger, diplomatically, that helps to mark the beginning of the Cold War was when Winston Churchill gave a speech in Fulton, Missouri in March of 1946 that has been nicknamed the Iron Curtain speech. In this speech, Winston Churchill stated, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and are all subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high, and in some cases, increasing measure of control from Moscow." The problem of the timing of Winston Churchill's speech was in March of 1946, no communists had actually yet seized control in any East European nations. But Soviet Red Army was still occupying these areas, much like the Americans and the British were still occupying areas of Western Europe. What Winston Churchill's speech is going to trigger is a perception on the part of Joseph Stalin and many East European communists that a new Cold War had been declared, and Churchill, in many ways, creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Prior to this speech, no communist dictatorships existed in Eastern Europe. After this speech, when Joseph Stalin learned a lesson from President Wilson from after World War I and propped up communist dictatorships throughout Eastern Europe to act as a border to protect and to guard the Soviet Union. Now, when we talk about this process of quote-unquote Stalinizing East European governments, we need to identify a broad three-step process that most East European nations followed in their path to becoming communist nations. Number one, immediately after the war, for the fact that the communists had played such an active part in the underground resistance movements, is that you had a popular front government existing in most of these countries of each of the different political groups who had stood against fascism and who had stood up against the Germans during periods of occupation. What's important to understand about the role of communists in these genuine democratic coalitions was that communists made sure that they got key positions in government in terms of dictating foreign policy and also in controlling the police force. By securing these two prominent and very powerful parts of the state, the communists were prepared, if necessary, to seize power if they perceived a threat was coming from the West. What we'll see is the next step is creating what we call a bogus coalition. What many of the communists started doing is that when other anti-fascist parties would speak out against communist policies, the communists would utilize the police force and the presence of Red Army troops to intimidate their opposition into silence. The final step in creating a monolithic bloc was the communists would either outlaw their political parties, encourage them to absorb themselves into their political party, and essentially creating single-party states. In unique places like Eastern Germany, which was called the German Democratic Republic, you actually technically had a multi-party state throughout the entirety of the Cold War. The problem was that the German Communist Party was the dominant political party and controlled the police of East Germany. And even though they allowed free democratic elections, throughout the period of the Cold War, potential opponent politicians stayed silent in any critiques of the government for fear that the secret police, known as the Stasi, would come after them. In terms of the initial program that the communists are going to implement in Eastern Europe, initially it has nothing to do with the ideas of dictatorship. First and foremost, since Eastern Europe had been the crossroads between German and Russian warfare twice now in 1 century, is East European governments are going to embrace a foreign policy that's friendly with the Soviet Union to try and make Stalin feel more secure about his western border. The next step after establishing friendly relations with the Soviet Union was a social revolution, where people who had actively collaborated with Nazi occupiers and assisted in such things as the Holocaust and genocide were actively persecuted and tracked down by these East European governments. The next step in order to start building a socialist society is these governments now would take over the banking industry and the manufacturing industry, declaring these different sectors of the economy to now be property of the government, that all employees of these sectors of the economy were now government employees, and that profits from these different industries would now be utilized to create social programs universally for all East European citizens. Perhaps one of the most dramatic aspects, though, was the redistribution of land to poor people, particularly in areas like Yugoslavia, where traditions of peasantry and serfdom had still clung on even into elements of the 20th century. Poor people who had never had an opportunity to own land were now granted free land by the government. In return, by getting this free land, what the government made sure of is they were buying the political allegiance of poor farmers. Not only to make sure that farming crops still came in on a consistent basis, but to make sure that poor farmers would not oppose the regime. To reflect upon this process, one of the fallacies we need to address immediately off the bat in talking about communism is that when people say such cliche phrases as, yeah, communism looks good on paper, doesn't work in reality, is they are wrong. The reality is actually the opposite. If you look at the model on paper, the implications are potentially horrifying. Because in reality, it works. The problem is the impact it has on transforming the lives of common people. What we are going to see is communist regimes in Eastern Europe, while they are technically considered dictatorships, they are going to transform the economies of Eastern Europe from primarily agrarian economies into modern industrial economies. By having government controlling the process of pushing forward industrialization and not having to rely upon private investment, the communists are going to help to create a huge amount of economic growth in Eastern Europe. The problem is, as the historian Robert Conquest reflects, quote, communism is one way of industrialization, just as cannibalism is one way of attaining a high-protein diet. Yes, communism works, but the question is, the price that common people pay in industrializing at such a rapid pace, is it really worth it? To understand the relationship between different communist parties throughout the world and the Soviet Union, we need to talk about two different international institutions that were headquartered in Moscow that had very different goals and purposes. The Communist International, also known as the Comintern, was founded in January of 1919 by Vladimir Lenin, just as foreign forces arrived on Russian soil during the Russian Civil War. The Communist International during the 1920s declared itself to be, quote, the General Staff of the International Class War. In order to try and get Western governments to back pressure off from the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin threatened to organize revolutionaries throughout the world, and that if Western governments were going to try and topple his government, that he would threaten to topple their governments. During the 1930s, in the era of the Popular Front, communists redefined themselves no longer as international revolutionaries, but as leaders of common people throughout the world and taking on the forces of fascism. In 1943, after Roosevelt and Stalin had a chance to meet at the Tehran Conference and talked about how the future of the world would be based upon peace and cooperation and friendship between the United States and the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin immediately disbanded the Communist International, declared that all communist parties could now take their own independent route when it came to politics, and that Moscow was no longer in control. That the only reason why they had control of this institution was to try to push forward foreign policies that would help to establish peace. In 1947, Joseph Stalin establishes what is known as the Cominform, which stands for the Communist Information Bureau. The Cominform had a very different agenda. What the Cominform claimed at the time was they were trying to unite the peoples of the world in a common struggle against imperialism under the leadership of different national communist parties. The reality of what Stalin was trying to do was to interlink the political power that he held in East European governments with domestic communists in Western Europe to try and influence foreign policies in Western Europe to make sure that West Europeans were not taking an aggressive stance that may threaten the Soviet Union. The reason why Stalin was so paranoid about national security and the future of his nation was not because he was plotting an international communist conspiracy. It's that Eastern Europe lay in complete ruin. Nazi racial policy, while is most famously known for its persecution and mass murder of Jewish people, Nazi racial policy also targeted all Slavic peoples. In places like Poland, these are where the death camps were, and it was the Russian Red Army that liberated the death camps. In order to stop the Nazi invasion and to stop Hitler from controlling the oil resources of the world, the communists instigated a policy in the Soviet Union that was incredibly costly. A scorched earth policy on their own country. While the United States was only attacked once during World War II, and Pearl Harbor was a great tragedy, we can't not even begin to imagine having 31,000 factories destroyed, 1,700 cities lying in complete ruin, and 25% of the reproducible wealth of a nation being absolutely destroyed. Once the Russian Red Army started pushing Nazi forces back after the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942, Eastern Europe became a place in complete shambles, as two major powers faced off in the bloodiest war the world has ever known. At the end of World War II, many people in Eastern Europe viewed the Red Army as the saviors of Europe. And Joseph Stalin used this great popularity to consolidate his power back home and to legitimize many of his own policies, many times in an unfair way. What we'll see is while the Russian Red Army was initially greeted as great liberators by East Europeans, that process soon changed. In 1945, in Poland, Joseph Stalin put together a government that did not exactly follow what was discussed at Yalta and Potsdam but he thought for the time, well, it would work for the time. What he did was he had a coalition government put together of the Polish Socialist Party, the Polish Communist Party, the Polish Peasant Party, and also members of the government that existed in Poland prior to World War II who had been in exile in London after Poland had fallen to the German invasion. What we need to understand about the Polish people is Poland has very long traditions of embracing and promoting ideas of socialism. Since socialist ideas first were given birth in Germany and were brought to fruition in Russia, and that Poland has always been the crossroads between these two nations, yes, Polish people were very attracted to ideas of socialism. But for the fact that they also had hundreds and hundreds of years of history of being dominated and controlled by outside forces, even though they were pro-socialists, most people who supported socialism in Poland were actually quite anti-Soviet in their political outlook. By the end of 1946, Joseph Stalin feared that Poland was, quote, slipping away from the other powers of Eastern Europe, and what he did in January of 1947 is he had the communists have an open democratic election that involved intimidation and voting manipulation. Prior to this election, all elections that took place in Poland had taken place under the supervision of what was called the Allied Control Commission, where representatives of all the major powers oversaw the democratic elections. The January 1947 victory of the communists, where they democratically brought in 80% of the vote. This was not an election where you had outside foreign powers supervising. What the communists did was they intimidated many people at the polls, they intimidated many people to stay home, and they also forged a number of the democratic ballots. What occurred after the communists won this landslide with 80% of the vote by rigging the election is they proposed that the Communist Party now merge with the Socialist Party and create what was called the United Polish Workers' Party. They argued that this coalition between socialists and communists represented the true will of the Polish people, and that this was not simply a communist dictatorship. The first leader of this government was a man by the name of Gomulka. Gomulka made sure, in terms of his foreign policies, to try and appease Stalin as much as possible, not because he wanted to be dominated by Stalin, but he wanted to appease any possibility that Stalin might have fears that Poland could be used as a place for a future invasion of Russia. By conceding to many of the fears that Joseph Stalin had, Gomulka was actually able to create in many ways a shield for the Polish people to protect them from outside intervention from the Soviets by accepting a certain level of Soviet domination. In July of 1952, the People's Republic of Poland was proclaimed, and this government is now going to stay in power until the year 1989. Romania is an incredibly complicated place. Number one, Romania, in terms of Eastern Europe, has been a crossroads of many civilizations, cultures, and empires. And the reason why you have traditions such as the mythological and legendary story of Count Dracula coming from places like Romania is that places like Transylvania oftentimes had to switch sides back and forth between different warring empires to try and protect their own people. The problem for Romania at the end of the war was technically during World War II, Romania had been one of the Axis powers. The reason why they were one of the Axis powers was not out of choice, was perhaps out of necessity. King Michael, who served as the last Romanian king, came to power in the year 1940, just as German forces were starting to arrive in Romania. And the poor young man was only 18 years old, and had no idea what to do. Once it became obvious that Germany was going to be defeated in World War II, King Michael had the Romanian government switch sides in 1944 to welcome the liberation coming from the Red Army and to encourage Romanians to resist against German occupation and to assist the Soviet Red Army. At this point, King Michael created a constitutional monarchy and appointed Romanian communists to be in control of the main elements of government. In 1945, the Allied Control Commission came in and oversaw democratic elections in Romania. And they agreed that the elections of 1945, that they were legitimate elections, and that collectively the Communist Party and the Socialist Party of Romania were legitimately the two largest and most popular political parties. The problem is, after this election, the Socialists and the Communists merged together into one political party called the National Democratic Front, arguing that since they had been the ones who had led the anti-fascist movements for the last 2 decades, that they represented the true voice of democracy and anti-fascism for the Romanian people. In November of 1947, the Communists and the Socialists worked collectively to rig the elections. And much like Poland, they were able to pull off an 80% majority. At this point, Stalin opened negotiations with King Michael. King Michael claimed at the time that he was heavily persecuted and forced off from the throne. And in April of 1948, when the People's Republic of Romania was declared and the monarchy was abolished, King Michael fled to Great Britain and spent the rest of his life living there. The problem with the story of King Michael is that more and more documents have shown since the end of the Cold War that King Michael was bought out by Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin allowed King Michael to take as much wealth and treasure with him as he wanted. And he also promised King Michael a certain level of Soviet protection wherever he decided to settle in the world. While King Michael claimed in many ways to be perhaps a victim of communist aggression, in all reality, he actively collaborated with the communists, was bought out, and essentially sold out the Romanian people to Soviet domination. Much like Romania, Bulgaria has a long history of being the crossroads of empires. And when German forces arrived in 1940, Bulgaria declared itself to be part of the Axis forces. Once Red Army soldiers arrived in Bulgaria, though, the Bulgarian government, like Romania, switched sides in late 1944 and now declared themselves to be on the sides of the Allies and to assist now when it came down to resisting German occupation. The thing that made Bulgaria very different is the first communist leader of Bulgaria is going to be a man by the name of Georgy Dimitrov. Throughout the 1930s, Georgy Dimitrov was the most famous anti-fascist in the entire world. Throughout the 1930s, he had been head of the Communist International, trying to organize coalitions throughout the world to prevent World War II from ever occurring. Throughout the war, Dimitrov had been at the head of keeping the Grand Alliance held together and coordinating resistance movements throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. And for the fact that Georgy Dimitrov was such a well-respected individual and so popular with so many people throughout the world, Georgy Dimitrov was legitimately, democratically elected into power. What occurred over the next couple of years, it was very similar to models we've seen in other nations. As he started redistributing land to poor peasants, he started nationalizing factories, and any members of the government who had actively worked with the Nazis were thrown out of government, many of them stripped of their property and threatened to be stripped of their citizenship. By December of 1947, the communists, through their actual popularity, declared themselves to be a people's republic and on the side of the Soviet Union when it came to the Cold War. Hungary is a real problem. During World War II, Hungary was not only a part of the Axis powers, but Hungary never switched sides at the end of the war. They stayed true to their collaboration with Hitler till the very end. Now the question is, at the end of the war, what do you do with the leader of that government, Admiral Horthy? Admiral Horthy, in many ways, was perhaps one of the most guilty parties in Eastern Europe when it came to the Holocaust. Towards the end of the war, Hungarian Jews had never been expelled. In 1944, under great pressure from Hitler, Horthy started collaborating. And during the final year of the war, the 500,000 Jews that had lived in Hungary previous to the war were reduced down to a population of approximately 25,000. After the war, the main political party that comes to power is a strange party called the Smallholders Party. What it was a political party that represented the voice of farmers who lived in small communities and small shop owners. In this coalition government, the communists made sure that even though they were a very small minority, that they were in control of the police. In 1947, very similar to other nations, there was an election, and 65% of the vote went to the Communist Party and to the Socialist Party collectively. For the fact that these two parties collectively now had a majority, they merged together into one political party, began to nationalize industry, and in August of 1949 declared Hungary to be a People's Republic. Czechoslovakia, perhaps, is the most tragic of all the tales of East European nations. For the fact that the Soviet Union had offered to protect democratic Czechoslovakia multiple times throughout the 1930s, and that Czechoslovakia had been sold out by the Western democracies of Great Britain and France in 1938 at the Munich Conference. The communists were incredibly popular in Czechoslovakia, and the Czechoslovakian people held great admiration for the Soviets and the Soviet Red Army. At the end of the war and the first election, the majority party who was elected to power is the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, without having to rig any of the elections. And all political parties in Czechoslovakia agreed broadly on the idea of transforming Czechoslovakia into a socialist nation. But the question was, what should the relationship be to Moscow? It's one thing for the Czechoslovakian people to have admiration and thankfulness to the Soviets for the assistance they had given in protecting Czechoslovakia in the 30s and liberating them during the war. But the great question is, which side should they be on as the Cold War started unfolding? The problem for the Czechoslovakian people is that in many ways, the choice was made for them by the United States. Czechoslovakia was offered funding by the United States to participate in the Marshall Plan. Joseph Stalin perceived that the Americans were trying to buy off Czechoslovakia. At this point, Czechoslovakian communists stopped cooperating as much with other political parties and started using more forceful tactics, in particular, utilizing the power of the police to intimidate any opponents who spoke out against communist control. For the fact that President Beneš was fearful that if he resisted the communists, that Czechoslovakia might face an internal civil war. As he resigned from power at the end of the spring of 1948 and allowed Klement Gottwald, the head of the Czechoslovakian Communist Party, to take over the government. In May of 1948, Czechoslovakia was also declared a People's Republic. The issue that came up at the opening of the Cold War is asking questions. What is the Cold War about? Is it about protecting democracy? Is it about anti-communism? Or is it being anti-Soviet? And if it is anti-Soviet, the great question being, should Western political leaders befriend East European communists who were willing to stand against Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union? The important thing to understand about Yugoslavia was that Yugoslavia was united and liberated not by outside forces, but by internal resistance. In the very beginning of Nazi occupation of Yugoslavia during World War II, Marshal Tito, who had been one of the heads of the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s, organized a patriotic, nationalistic underground resistance movement that brought together Serbs, Croatians, and Bosnians into a common coalition to work together to liberate their nation from Germany. For the fact that a communist had led this national liberation movement. In 1945, when free democratic elections were held in Yugoslavia, Marshal Tito was overwhelmingly and democratically elected into power. In 1945, he declared Yugoslavia to be the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia. And pause for a moment on that. Alicia, I'm still recording. I'll call you back in a minute. Sorry about that phone call. The problem for Joseph Stalin when it came down and what to do with Yugoslavia was, since he did not have Red Army forces in Yugoslavia and the Yugoslavian people clearly supported Tito, Stalin couldn't control this man. And when it came down to the Greek Civil War after World War II, when Joseph Stalin refused to assist Greek communists in their fight against the British, Marshal Tito said that Stalin had betrayed the communist movement of the world, and he sent arms and he sent organizers to Greece to assist those Greek communists. Stalin was quite concerned, since Tito was such a populist and so well respected by so many people throughout Eastern Europe, that Tito could set what would be called the threat of a good example, and that Yugoslavia could potentially be an alternative leader for alternative models of building up communist nations. In June of 1948, Joseph Stalin declared that Marshal Tito had betrayed the international communist movement, that he was plotting with powers of the West, and he expelled Yugoslavia from any representation in the common form. What he also did was he utilized Tito as a pretext to purge any of his political opposition domestically in the Soviet Union, arguing that these people were somehow also collaborating with Tito to try and challenge Stalin's rule. What we'll see in this scenario is Marshal Tito now looking to the West as a potential ally against the communist Soviet Union. Throughout the Cold War, strangely enough, the United States is going to assist in funding and propping up that Yugoslavian communist government. And the Yugoslavian government is never going to be an ally of the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. And for the fact that they had perhaps the greatest tragedy in shifts of politics was not the communist regimes that were propped up throughout Eastern Europe, but the perception that Joseph Stalin had of Israel once it was created officially in 1948. For the fact that when Israeli nationalists fought a terrorist campaign against Great Britain and forced Great Britain to give Israel independence and to recognize the state of Israel, many people had assumed, since the Red Army had assisted and been the main force in liberating the concentration camps, that Israel would naturally, as a Jewish state, be an ally of the Soviet Union. The problem for the Israelis at this point is immediately upon the birth of the nation of Israel, as Israel was invaded and threatened by its Arab neighbors. Israel needed money, Israel needed assistance, and the Soviet Union had neither money or assistance to spare. But the United States did. By the beginning of 1949, Joseph Stalin started perceiving that Israel was now an active collaborator with the United States, and that perhaps they were plotting with the Americans and with the CIA to try and destabilize the Soviet Union. In July of 1942, Stalin's paranoia came to a new level in what was referred to popular at the time as the Doctor's Plot. One of the chief officials in his government, a man by the name of Andrei Zhdanov, died while under the care of a Jewish doctor. What Stalin claimed at the time was that that doctor, who had close relations with many leaders in Israel, was in reality a CIA agent, and that he had actually murdered Zhdanov on behalf of the CIA. What occurred in the next couple of weeks is that 36 different prominent doctors of Jewish background were arrested by the Soviet government and accused of plotting against the Soviet government in an international conspiracy to try and legitimize this new trend, Joseph Stalin held a series of trials of prominent Jews, accusing them of treason against the Soviet Union, and in late February of 1953 actually outlawed the Jewish religion, which made Soviet leaders furious. Out of his own personal paranoia, Joseph Stalin was now sounding much like Adolf Hitler had. And for the fact that the Soviet leaders had taken great pride not only in bringing an end to the Holocaust, but in the fact that the very first law the Soviet Union had passed after the success of the Russian Revolution was a law outlawing anti-Semitism. As most Soviet leaders felt now that Stalin had betrayed every principle the Soviets had ever stood for. And what we'll see over the next year, as Stalin argues that his doctors are plotting against him, the reality is other communists are plotting against him, trying to facilitate his death and downfall. One of the reasons why Stalin was so paranoid, though, was not just what he perceived as internal enemies, but a military alliance that was created in Western Europe in 1949 called NATO. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and represented a military coalition of North American nations of the United States and Canada with nations of Western Europe, arguing that any attack against any member state would be considered an attack on all member states, and that this was to deter any potential communist aggression. The reality of what happened with NATO in its first year, though, was not a deterrence of communist aggression. It was a cover for President Truman to bring forward an even more radical policy. As in 1950, President Truman, after the creation of West Germany, proposed the idea of rearming Germany and giving Germany a military and to opening up the arms factories again. And in order to do that, any German industrial leaders who had actively collaborated with the Nazis and profiteered off from World War II and the Holocaust needed to be let out of prison to run this economy. Truman argued at the time that this was the only way to revive the German economy, that Americans needed German military assistance when it came down to things such as the outbreak of the Korean War, and that West Germany could be trusted to have a military if that military were under control of NATO leadership. For Truman, being psychologically separated from the European experience by the Atlantic Ocean, did not understand what the creation of NATO and the rearmament of West Germany meant to East Europeans. But the fact that the Soviets had just lost 30 million people to German militarism and burned a quarter of their nation to the ground to stop any future aggression from Germany, and that Stalin and Roosevelt had envisioned that after the war, Germany would never be united again, Germany would never be allowed to have a military or even industry again, and that Germany would simply be a peaceful farmland in the middle of Europe. To Stalin, West German rearmament meant a full-fledged declaration of war. And while Stalin did not organize any military coalitions to counter NATO, after Stalin's death we'll see Nikita Khrushchev creating in 1955 what was called the Warsaw Pact, which was a military alliance of East European communist nations to face off against the NATO alliance of West European capitalist nations, And by 1955, with the creation of the Warsaw Pact, one could say at that point that an Iron Curtain truly had descended across Europe. And the problem with Winston Churchill's speech is he gave it 9 years too early and helped to trigger the creation of that Iron Curtain. When we come back with our next lecture, we'll turn back to domestic politics in the United States to understand many of the